Welcome to Teamwork, A Better Way, the podcast filled with stories, experiences, and insights from leading high-performing team experts. Here are your hosts, Spencer Horn and Christian Napier.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Teamwork, A Better Way. I'm Christian Napier, joined by my amazing co-host, Spencer Horn. Spencer, how are you doing today?
Good. Full of sugar and icing from last night's cookie party.
Oh, man. Sounds like I missed out.
We made lots and lots and lots of cookies and lots of frosting and sprinkles and decorations.
So were you making sugar cookies then?
Yeah, so we have a annual Horn holiday party. I'll try to put some on my story on social media, but we have tacos, and just as many as you can eat, and then my wife makes cookies, and everybody has their own trays and boxes they can carry them home, but we decorate them. And yeah,
well, that sounds like amazing fun. It sounds delicious too. And coincidentally, we had tacos last night as well, but we didn't have the cookie celebration. So I'll need to put that one on our tradition list. I love that. So this is our final podcast before Christmas, the Christmas break. Super excited to see you before Christmas. Do you have fun holiday plans scheduled?
Yeah, well, my family's in town. We're all together for the next couple of days. Tonight we're going to the Luminaria and then out to sushi. And then tomorrow we're going to we have a traditional German dinner and just we're doing a service project and some other things. So just family party time and time together right now.
That sounds good. I could go for a nice schnitzel and some. Yeah, that sounds really good. Yeah, coincidentally, my son-in-law served his mission in Berlin, Germany, and his church mission, and so he really likes the German food. So when we try to get together, we try to do the German food if we can. But sounds fantastic. Let's get into our topic though, because we can just sit here and talk for hours about little stuff. But we got an exciting topic. I saw this in Harvard Business Review as an article that was coming out in the upcoming magazine published just recently. Oh gosh, what was the title of the article? Is called "Leaders Must React: A Framework for Responding to Unforeseen Events" by Nitin Noria. And I apologize if I butchered the name, but it was quite an interesting article, and I shared it with you, and you're like, hey, let's go with that for a topic for this week. And one of the things that I want to start out with, because and I want to ask you this question, Spencer, because I know you work with so many CEOs, so many executives, and so many companies and verticals. The studies that they did show, and again, it's pretty limited study, but tracking a range of Fortune 500 CEOs,
they're
24/7, in 15 minutes. How are they spending their time? And on average, CEO of a large organization was spending 36% of their time reacting to unforeseen events, which is a significant number. And I know there's a lot of variation. The sample size is small. The minimum, I think, was like 14%. And there was another CEO who had 81% of the time they felt like they were spending in reactive mode. But what are you seeing out there in the work that you are doing with CEOs? And have you seen any trending one way or another? Or has it been pretty constant, ever since because you've been working with them for decades? It's always been this way where, they're reacting to, spending a significant amount of their day reacting to unforeseen events.
It's a good question, Christian. And in my experience, it varies all across the board. It varies by, what stage a business is in, in terms of the growth curve and how much cash they have on hand and how much impact outside events have on the business. It also matters the temperament of the CEO. Are they able to let go? Are they able to kind of categorize the challenges and the impacts of external and internal events. So all of those things are extremely different. Are they going through a merger or acquisition? Are they? Every company is in a different stage of progression and different needs. And so I see it all over the board. There are times when I see leaders that are much more than 36% in that reactive mode. And I think sometimes maybe less. You know, when I was really reading this, I thought a lot of the Stephen Covey book, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And he introduced that. At the time, I thought it was, Stephen Covey's brilliance, but it was really the Eisenhower quadrant, right? And that's something I talk a lot of with CEOs. Are you in the quadrant that most people seem or they feel? The answer is, if you ask a CEO anecdotally, most of them may feel like they're more than 36% in reactionary mode, or what we call focused on important and urgent. Seems like that urgent and important takes so much of our time. So my answer is it varies. And of course, when there are major events like we had with the COVID situation in 2020, also the outbreak of the Ukraine-Russia war, and in some cases even the regional conflict there with Israel and Hamas, businesses can be affected. Supply chains are being disrupted because of that war. Supply chain through the Red Sea is now disrupted, and that's impacting a lot of businesses. So it's interesting. These types of things can really make a huge impact that can either make or break a CEO.
One of the questions that I have when thinking about this topic is, and it's not discussed too much in this article, but we recognize that there are going to be things that we cannot predict because the world there are too many variables in the system, so you cannot predict everything.
Of course.
But I would say most mid to large size companies, I mean, they have enterprise risk management capabilities usually in-house. They do a lot of risk planning. They do a lot of risk mitigation planning, and you're looking at various contingencies. And so, sometimes on the surface, when I look at some of these things and I hear a CEO is spending 81% of his time or her time reacting to unforeseen events, I'm like, well,
how's that possible?
Hold on here. Like, how's this possible? I mean,
Right.
Don't you have folks in your organization and it's their job to look at these unforeseen effects? I come from an Olympic environment, a major sport event environment. Risk mitigation is a huge thing. And, it usually, the big ones are in 3 buckets, right? One is natural disasters. 2 are the epidemic, these kind of things. And then 3 are, the public security threat,
yeah.
the acts of terrorism or a war or those kind of things. And so even though, we didn't foresee COVID happening, I know that they had, strategic planning sessions and tabletop exercises where people are discussing what happens if we have an outbreak of this. What is the process that we follow? Now with COVID, it became even more extreme because they had to postpone the whole thing by a year. I'm taking a long time to answer this question. I'm just making a bit of commentary, I guess, but why do we have so many unforeseen events, particularly for Fortune 500 or global organizations that have teams that are dedicated to planning for contingencies?
It's a very good question, and I think that it's, if you think about just what happened in 2020, when was the last great pandemic? What was that, 1918? I mean, 100 years ago. And so circumstances are different. A lot of times we think, well, we'll be able to handle it, or things will be different now, or it's not going to impact us. Or I remember you and I, when we started our podcast, we were saying things like, this will end. And of course we were right about that, but when it would end, we were completely wrong about. And so the CEO and the leader's ability to react. So let's just take that for example. Hey, we think this is going to be over in 3-4 months. We get to 6 months and we realize, that's wrong. So how do you react? How quickly do you react? Are you constantly reacting? You may make a new plan based on this crisis is going to last for 3-4 months. And then very quickly you have to be able to extend those plans and adapt. And some CEOs did very well at that. Others didn't. And so I don't know the answer. I think it's going to be situational. Some businesses were impacted more acutely than others. And so sometimes that's the luck of the draw. I mean, what do you think, Christian? You have, with all of your experience, what are you saying? You're asking me, and I know you work with lots of executives, and you're talking in these circles where you're planning for these 3 areas of risk mitigation.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the information inputs that the CEO gets. And we talked a little tiny bit about this before we went on air. You mentioned the Eisenhower matrix, and the author of the article proposes a similar matrix, a similar tool called the Reactive Management Framework, putting things on an axis of how it looks right now and what it might look like over time, right? So those are the 2 axes, and you have these different quadrants, which is, well, if it doesn't look like it's a big thing now and we don't think it's going to be big over time, then don't worry about it. If it appears really big now, but it will diminish over time, then there's another strategy for that. And they call that the siren song quadrant. And then there's the whisper warning quadrant, which is, it looks like it's small now, but could turn into something big in the future. And then there's the clarion call, which is where the CEOs are spending 36% of their time, right? Because they see it as it's big and it could be significant over the long run. So I need to address this right now. Right. And you got to be all in on on these 4 things. So one of the questions that I had was, well, how do you make this determination about what goes into what quadrant, right? Because you may not have all the inputs that you need in order to make that determination, or those inputs could be feeding you biased information. I'll give you a funny example. Okay. So when it comes to bidding for major sport events, the event owners, depending on the organization, they may ask the entity that is bidding, where it's a city or a country, whatever, to do a risk assessment during the bid, right? So they'll look at those things like natural disasters, the risk of a terrorist attack, whether it's a physical attack or it's a cyber attack or those kind of things. So there's and the environmental risks and so on and so forth. And typically what you would do is you would identify these, and then you would give a rating of them in terms of their impact and probability, right? So in this particular example, I'm not going to name the city, but this assessment gets with all of it gets out to all these different entities, so security forces and leaders in the community and so on and so forth. And I remember getting the risk assessment back, because people were like populating spreadsheets, and they would say, okay, well, I think the risk is this. Well, what would happen is every one of these folks who are reporting risks are reporting them as high impact risks because they
area
are high
of
impact
responsibility
to them.
Right.
But they're not necessarily high impact to the
global.
entire organization
Yes.
or to the country. So what happens is you get a bunch of people that are in their own little sphere, that feel like they are having an existential crisis. I remember in one specific example, something being identified as super high impact, and the item that it was, will we be able to get solar panels installed on the roof of the athlete village? Well, for this person who's the environment person, he thought that was a high impact thing. But come on, when you're talking about, are you going to be able to pull this event off or not? In the grand scheme of things, being able to have solar panels on the roof of the village is not a high risk. It's not in the clarion call quadrant here. It's in the normal noise. Don't get involved. That's not, but what happens, you get a bunch of people who are your direct reports or people, and they are all raising fire alarms. Like, we got problems. And it takes, I think, a CEO that has perspective to be able to say, well, you know what? Actually, this thing, not that big a deal. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. And just the ability to not react to the emotion. What you're describing is what's called the fog of war. And right, the idea of the fog of war is you are at a point on the battlefield and you're getting attacked and you may be losing. And so you think you're losing the war. And it just means that, maybe at your spot, there's extra resistance, but all other fronts are moving ahead and doing well. And so you retreat, and that can actually cause the turning of the tides for the success of the entire army, when you don't see how you fit into the bigger scheme and how everything else is going. So there's just wanted you to say,
Joey, great to see you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for tuning in.
Right. And so that's a challenge that the leader has, is to be able to frame the situation. And so a big part of the job of the CEO is to be able to understand the big picture, but also be able to tell that story and to educate people that, there are times when you've got to get out of that silo and go to different places and, on the front and the battle, so you can see what's really going on. That's hard to do, but being able to be able to tell that story is important. It's interesting when Russia invaded Ukraine, the article, I've been talking about this, as we all have for a long time. When that happened, my initial feeling was, this is World War II all over again. This is World War III happening just the way World War II happened, and this could really escalate to a major conflagration. And that still may happen, but I think you need to consider those possibilities. And in a way, it is almost a world war. I mean, it's like we have Axis and allies that we've got the world divided in their support for these countries. And it's not turned into a hot war for everybody, but it is definitely has risk. And for organizations that had businesses and headquarters or offices or franchises in Russia, huge impact. And how did you size that, and how did you address the risk there? You had to be able to react very, very quickly. There's still some businesses that are there, and they've taken big hits. They've been, some of their businesses have actually been nationalized, or it's an interesting time right now. And so getting this right, I think, is important. But you have highlighted one of the skills that a CEO needs to have, and that is not to get sucked into every discussion that comes with emotion and energy. And make sure that you're looking at the big picture and not just one little crisis that is maybe exaggerated.
I think that's a great point. And Spencer, one of the questions that I have for you, most of the examples that are cited in the article are with very large, very well-known companies, and the examples are public knowledge.
Or even country. We're talking about Jimmy
But
Carter versus
that's right, or
Monica
even
Lewinsky, right?
or even countries, and you know, many of the examples that are cited, they talk about something that where the reaction of the company may not have been the right reaction, and may have actually inflamed the situation, made it worse. So something that could have been a whisper warning, because of the strategy deployed by the organization to quote unquote nip that thing in the bud, being the wrong strategy, it ends up being a much bigger issue than it should have been otherwise. I'm curious, in your experience, not naming names or anything, but have you had experiences with organizations where there something came up, they decided on a strategy, we're going to attack it like this, it ended up being totally the wrong strategy, which created a much huger problem than if they would have taken a different tack?
The answer is yes. And it's interesting. I mean, you have to make decisions. I mean, hundreds of decisions every day. I mean, that could be as small as who to hire, who to release out into the world and get out of your company. And those may seem like small things, but the strategies, for example, of do we make an acquisition right now? Do we buy this piece of equipment? How do we invest our money? Do we extend ourselves and take advantage of certain opportunities, and what risk does that bring in terms of how does that impact our labor force, our team, to be able to stretch their capabilities until we are able to get the cash flow to cover and hire more people. I mean, there's so many decisions that have to be looked at, especially for companies that most of our listeners may be familiar with, maybe you work at, that we're talking 20 million, 100 million, or even $5 million a year companies. The impacts of our decisions and the challenges that our markets and businesses face are, I think, amplified, magnified. So I have seen that. For example, just making a non-decision to address a leader within the organization's bad behavior, and how that can lead everything. So much of success is momentum and energy, and if you ignore a problem, it can carry the organization in a negative momentum direction that can spread to employees. And I mean, think of sports, for example. If you got a winning team, and the perspective is maybe you had a down year, they recruit some hotshot players. Well, all of a sudden you lose a bunch of people to the transfer portal, or to exiting early to the NFL. It can have the impression like, oh my gosh, we're imploding. How are we gonna win our next game? And that can cause people to actually say, I got to jump ship now. I got to get off this. This is going to lose, and it's going to taint my my reputation. And so you see that momentum, and this that can lead to, that's that fog of war, can lead to losses that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So how do you manage that in a way that says, listen, this is all normal. This is exactly what's happening. If you think about the Tuckman's theory of organizational change, right? You got the forming, storming, norming, performing, all of that. One of the most challenging stages of any organization is that storming phase. It is uncomfortable. It is, people are struggling to figure out where they fit and make a name for themselves, and pushing back against rules and regulations, and having what power and authority, and what's the structure, where do I fit in, and that there's a lot of chaos. If the employees feel like this is the culture that's going to persist in the organization, that can be very detrimental to the future success of the team. But a great leader can say, listen, this is all normal. We're figuring it out. We're going to figure it out, and we will get through this, and things are going to be great. Sure, we lost somebody to the transfer portal. Sure, we have to work temporarily right now, extra hours because of this merger that we've done, or this new product that we're implementing. But this is going to make it easier for us. There's going to be greater opportunities, growth for you. So being able to tell that story, that you will succeed, we will succeed, and all will be well.
All right. So I love that you brought up the transfer portal, because it highlights another thing that we talked about a little bit before we came on air. And you brought this point up, which is such an important point, is you have to be flexible. You have to be adaptable. Okay. So in the US, in college sports, you didn't really have this thing called transfer portal.
Thanks for clarifying for the rest of the world.
But due to some changes in litigation and or regulations and so on and so forth, where players or student athletes in college were not allowed to earn income from their participation in a sport. And then the regulations changed so that they could earn income from their name, image, and likeness. And also at that time, they came up with this idea of the transfer portal. If you weren't happy with the situation where you're at a certain university, you could transfer to another university. What does this have to do with flexibility and adaptability? Well, a lot of coaches were out there saying, well, shoot, we have a new landscape. How are we going to adapt to these new rules and regulations? And some were able to make that adaptation quickly, and there are others, and the most famous of whom is the coach of Clemson, Dabo Swinney, who says, well, we would prefer not to use the transfer portal and develop our own players. Well, that's great, but what happens when your own players leave? What are you going to do? And as a result, their performance on the field has suffered because they have been slow to flexible and adapt to this change. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what you're seeing with CEOs, executives out there, where we have seen a lot of changes in the landscape from COVID to then we had the what was it called, the Great Resignation, to quiet quitting, to all these tech layoffs, and it's just been, and then although Ukraine, we seem to be bombarded with these unforeseen events. How are you seeing people being flexible and adaptable to be able to be nimble and address these unforeseen situations quickly and effectively?
I'm seeing both. I see leaders that are doing a great job, and I mean, I have a limited perspective. Obviously, I don't. With the clients that I work with, they have this attitude that they want to invest in their people, and part of that perspective is, if we invest in our people, we're going to make a better experience for all of the employees. One of the greatest areas that any organization can focus on is middle management, to really have a positive impact on the overall culture of the organization, because they're the ones that got promoted because they did a great job, but they don't have a lot of leadership experience, and that can be a real source of pain and frustration. HubSpot is a company that's a tech company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that is probably close to, I don't know, they're a big company now, and they recruit from Harvard, MIT, all the smartest kids, but they would do quarterly employee reviews, and they got slammed with their culture, even though they had all this great environment and all the services and food and just a great place to work. The problem was everyone they were promoting were so young and inexperienced. They were creating a terrible experience for the employees. And so those leaders that would say, hey, we've got to invest in our people fast right now so that we can make sure that they're creating the environment we need, and they're representing us as the leadership team the way that they should. Some leaders get that, and some don't. And so that's what I'm brought into a lot of the time, Christian, is to help change the skill level of those leaders so that they can reduce the dysfunction between themselves and those that are on their teams. You have the Great Resignation happen because so many organizations are dysfunctional. Only 12% of teams worldwide are high performing. So this is a big area of frustration. People are like, hey, if I can make an extra $1 an hour over here, I'm going to leave. Why? Because I'm not happy here. But if there is a culture that is strong enough that I know people care about me and invest in me, I'm connected to that culture. So whether there's a crisis, a challenge, I have to work extra hard right now because of COVID has shown up, and so I need to work 60 hours instead of my normal 40 hours. I'm all in. I'm not going to look for the next transfer portal opportunity. I'm going to stay put because I know that they care about me. I am working with my team. And so for me, the best leaders are recognizing that it's not the company that they're working for, it's you. Yes, they got attracted to the brand, Southwest area. Hey, I want to work there. It's a great company. Or I want to work at KPMG, or, I want to have Goldman Sachs on my resume. That may be the initial thing, but when they get in there and they find that it's not as good as they'd hoped, or maybe they find that it's better, it's all because of the people that they get in there with. And so that's what I see. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so it really comes down to people, and that's one of the challenges, right? Because oftentimes when you have unforeseen events that have material financial impact on an organization, sometimes the first thing to go is this budget that invests in the people, right? So you may be you're reducing your workforce potentially, but also you're not investing as much in the people who are remaining because you got other places you need to put the money, to keep the business viable. And so you create this like vicious circle where you're not investing in people, so they're not performing, so the business is not performing as well as it should. And because of the reduced revenues, you end up cutting people and reducing your investment in people, and it just goes and goes and goes. And then before you know it,
you wonder what just happened. That actually happened to me when I was in 2008. I was recruited to work for a company, a leadership training and development company, and that's right when the recession happened in 2008. So I started working there in March of 2008, and by a couple months later, our revenues were cut in half. It was one of the very first expenses that companies eliminated because of, just fiscal responsibility, if that's what you want to call it. It's interesting, though, that those companies that continued to invest in their people were incredibly poised to take advantage of the economy when it turned around. Their people were ready to go. They were energized. They had, when things are going well, it's like, we don't have enough time. We need all the time. We can't train our people. When things are going poorly, well, we don't have enough money. So this is the problem, that you have to invest in good people, and they will help you to minimize the time that you spend in unimportant, but urgent activities, or urgent and important fires that you need the help of your team. That's that clarion call. You need people to be able to brainstorm with, to really come up with lots of different strategies, not just one or two, but multiple strategies that you can adapt as needed. So the key is always people, because your strategy is going to change, Christian, and where those strategies come from.
Yeah, they come from people.
Right.
Absolutely right. One other thing I wanted to touch on that was mentioned in the article was a 3-step process introduced by the author to execute in this framework. And those steps were sensing, sizing, and responding. And I know we've touched on it, throughout our conversation today. things to do, not do when it comes to sensing and sizing. I'm curious your perspective on responding. The way I want to frame it is like this. Responses can be motivated by emotions as well as facts, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they can be motivated by fear. It could be fear of consumer behavior reacting negatively. It could be fear of lawsuits filed by your customers, for doing this or doing that. It could be fear of shareholders reacting negatively to the way you respond to a situation. And so I'm curious, in your work with CEOs and leaders, how do you address this fear so that people can take rational responses to unforeseen events and not overreact or react inappropriately because they are operating in fear? Are we going to get sued? Are the shareholders going to revolt? Are we going to lose clients? And it becomes a very fear-driven thing. So what's been your experience, Spencer, in working with CEOs and helping them, behave and work and make decisions rationally and not be overcome by fear?
I've spoken many times about Kelvin. He was the CEO of two publicly traded companies. And I remember we had a crisis in one of the companies. I was the vice president of this company. Again, I had corporate responsibilities. It was a publicly traded company. I was a young man with, I don't know that I really understood all the risk that it involved being that public officer. But sometimes the shareholders would raise an alarm and be frustrated, and they would shout out. And so Kelvin was really good at keeping his pulse on the finger of the shareholders. Now, if all the shareholders are saying one thing, that's something to listen to. But if you've got some talking about a problem and others not, then you've got to be able to keep your head and to be able to stay calm and be able to articulate a position that is helping to win over those who may be opposed to your position. And that, again, it comes back to the idea of energy. If you're fearful, that will impact all of your policies, all of your strategies, all of your reactions. And so you have to be able to be that leader that creates a calm. If you look at what's happening in Ukraine, who knew that Volodymyr Zelensky would be so great at responding to the crises that he has every day? As a former entertainer, nobody thought he was up to the task. One of the things that he's doing, he's managing optics, how people are feeling like they're doing, whether they're having success or not, when they have great success, not, hey, listen, don't get overexcited. When they're having not as much success, hey, this is normal, right? If somebody's really not all in on the strategies, replacing them, whether you agree with that or not. But he's not panicking, and he is showing courage, and that's what you need to do. You've got to be able to set the stage of how you want your people to behave by not reacting with panic or fear. And if you feel that panic or fear, find someone outside of the organization that you can have that release with, so that when you've done with that therapy, you come back to your people strengthened and clear about what it is you want to do. You have to speak in a clear tone. I think of Winston Churchill. He was a great leader in a crisis, not so great outside of a crisis, but with a crisis, he was in dire circumstances, but he always spoke with, hey, we've had some terrible losses. We acknowledge that, but we will prevail. We will fight them in the streets and the alleys. And he just had that courage to say things as they were and as they needed to be with confidence. So Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, we now have a word to describe that kind of leadership, Churchillian, right? Like we
Churchillian leadership.
that's how we describe that kind of leadership. Thinking in a
By the way,
corporate
folks, this is
context.
complete. This is, even though we're talking about this article, this is completely unscripted. So we're just
But thinking of an example on the corporate side that was high profile, just happened in the last few weeks, the unexpected ouster of the CEO of OpenAI, right? Sam Altman. The board takes a vote, they kick him out, and it's like total chaos. But I got to give props to the CEO of Microsoft, right? Who this situation is happening, and what does he do? He takes decisive action right away and says, okay, so Sam, folks, you're going to come over here to Microsoft. We're going to create this new division and we're going to make this thing happen, right? Like he didn't wait for days and weeks and months, to see, well, how's this all going to play out? He got enough information where he could make a decision, and then he acted. And I think there's something to be said about that, where people go in and they're not timid about it. And okay, we got a serious situation. This is the clarion call. I mean, this was definitely a clarion call situation for OpenAI and for Microsoft, who is the largest, I think they're the single largest investor in OpenAI, having pumped billions of dollars into this thing. And he's like, okay, we're making a move and this is what we're going to do, and I find that inspiring. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but because I'm not close to the situation, I don't understand everything, all the intricacies of everything here. But it was great to see a leader step in within 24 hours and say, okay, this is what we're doing. Here we go, and that calmed a lot of people's fears. It also, got OpenAI to kind of rethink how they were doing things and so on and so forth, because he was willing to take such decisive action so quickly. Yeah. I don't know what your thought is on that.
Oh, I think that's fascinating, and I agree. I mean, it was like the board actually backtracked, and they're like, well, maybe we made a mistake because of the confidence and decisiveness, or just the what did again, sorry for all the military references. General Patton, U.S. World War II general, said, a good plan violently executed today is better than a perfect plan next week. Right. And so part of this approach that we're taking is have a violent plan that you execute right away, even if it's not perfect, because you'll probably pivot again next week. And being able to do that with confidence is a sign of I think a great leader. I'm curious.
We're not advocating violence here or anything like this, but we're using it in the term
violently applying your strategy.
Means
with urgency and energy.
Enthusiastically and wholeheartedly going for it, rather than just timidly dipping your toe in the water to see what the temperature is.
Yeah,
and then asking 500,000 other people, what they think about this, that, or the other. Going and just take action, do it. So I think it's
so you've asked me a lot of questions. Now let me ask you a question. You and I talked about maybe a little more of a controversial situation with the Bud Light scenario, right? And I'm really curious as to how you perceive they rolled out a marketing plan that was not well received. I'm just curious as to what you saw in terms of leadership, how they responded. Was this a clarion call, or was it a whisper warning?
It could have been a whisper warning or a siren song. But the reaction was definitely more clarion call. It's been interesting because, and I'm not saying any of this to say I take position on one side or the other.
Not
of the argument here. Yeah. I'm just taking a look at it, because there are some other precedents in the corporate world for this, where someone has, or an event has happened, or some action was taken, and you thought it was going to be a huge thing at the time, but it turned out, at least from a business sense, to not be that big, right? So the thing that I'm thinking about that I think is relevant to the Bud Light situation is Chick-fil-A, right? So Chick-fil-A, for those of you here in the U.S. or are familiar with the story of Chick-fil-A, it was founded by and is run by a family that is Christian-centered values family, and so they're not open on Sundays. You can't go there and buy a sandwich and so on and so forth. Well, here in the States, with the advancement of gay rights and same-sex marriage and all this kind of stuff, organizations like Chick-fil-A, who were running their business based on these quote unquote traditional Christian values, came under fire for some of their policies. And so there were active boycotts, of Chick-fil-A. You can't go here and eat. And, what everybody has seen over time is that, it was all over the news. It was making headlines everywhere, but then it blows over. Is Chick-fil-A suffering today?
No.
Because of the values they espoused and the boycotts that were organized. And again, I'm not taking a position on whether it was
I think
right
that's
or wrong.
A great comparative analogy, really.
But I mean, Chick-fil-A is killing it here. In Fort Union, 5 minutes from my house is a Chick-fil-A. It doesn't matter any time of day I drive by there. There's a line of cars, like 15 cars long, trying to buy a sandwich. Chick-fil-A, they're doing just fine. And so it's hard, I think, for businesses, and this is the responding part of this, 3-level thing: sensing, sizing, responding, to know, like, how should I react to this certain situation? Because you can overreact to these things. And but I think for people who are seasoned business professionals, sometimes they can look at this and say, you know what, it's big right now, but it will blow over. And so we're just going to, take these precise corrective actions if needed to address the situation, but we're not going to overreact to this. And I see that happen to Chick-fil-A, with Chick-fil-A, and
that's right.
And they turned out to be just fine. They didn't
problems
suffer
are
really
exacerbated today because the news media picks some of these stories up and really accelerates the pressure, because we're adding a cultural element in our society here. I don't know how polarized I feel like this country is polarized in terms of culture and politics and all these things that we're talking about, and it bleeds over into business. And so leaders have to be able to address that, because they're getting pressure, and it can kill the business. Chick-fil-A withstood that. Bud Light's going to be they're going to be okay, but they certainly lost their position in the marketplace in the short term. And I think that at the time, people that were talking on behalf of the organization were saying this is a clarion call, and you're saying it was probably more of a whisper warning, and they needed to not overreact.
Or it was a siren song, which is, it sounds,
sorry.
It looks really big now, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to be a huge issue in the long run.
That's right.
But it's tricky, right? Because it's hard to know in the moment whether it's going to be a big issue long term or not, because you just see the crisis that's in front of you, and so it becomes this clarion call. The risk is that you overreact, and then you cause more damage than you should because of the way you reacted to this situation. And like I said, with the Chick-fil-A thing, it was big in the media. It was like 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer than that, where it was a huge issue for a few months. And then, people went on to the next, the general population kind of went on to the next crisis. Right. And so, you have to make that judgment call, I think, as a CEO and as a board, to say, okay, is this one of these things that's going to, it's going to lose momentum once another crisis appears, and everybody's going to run over and see the train wreck that's happened over in this other area,
Right.
and they're just going to forget about what's going on over here with you. You're just the crisis of the moment for the general population.
So, Christian, why don't we talk about what actions a CEO should take based on which of these 4 quadrants they find themselves in? If you've sized the problem, if you've looked at where you are in terms of these 3 steps, how you respond. I mean, what is the appropriate reaction? And so let's just talk about that briefly, shall we?
Let's do it.
So think about the normal noise, right? These are small issues that are likely to remain small. So if you're a CEO, don't get personally involved in those routine matters. Let your team, let your organization handle those, right? I mean, if something's going on with your team, if there's an employee that wants to enter the transfer portal, or they're frustrated by the commission structure or whatever, they feel like it's unfair. Let your key people handle that. Let your HR departments manage that. However, you don't want to ignore those, right? I mean, if, for example, if there's an employee issue, you need to be checking Glassdoor to see what kinds of, as people leave your organization, what are they saying? What's getting out to the public? So trust your team, at the same time verify that they're handling it the right way. And you can do that in your accountability meetings. Just ask for updates, let them handle it, but keep your finger on the pulse, so to speak. What would you add to that?
I think that's a great idea. And what I would say to that specific example is, and I think you alluded to it when what you were saying is there a trend here, right? So it could be, I lost my chief technology officer left for another opportunity, and maybe that's a one-off, or it could be that I'm Apple and Joni Ivey leaves, my head designer. Maybe that's a one-off thing. But if I start to see a broader exodus of talent, so I got a lot of people entering into that quote unquote transfer portal, then that could be the whisper warning, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
So it then transitions from a normal noise thing to a whisper warning thing, which is, okay, let's take some action now and nip this thing in the bud so it doesn't become a clarion call issue later when 50% of my people are gone.
Right.
So can we identify a trend relatively early on, so that something that could be a massive issue, we've gone ahead and we've taken some proactive steps and we've nipped it in the bud.
And that's that nip in the bud strategy is, that's really what Covey talked about, being in the preventative quadrant. So it's important, but it's not urgent yet. But we're seeing a trend moving that way. So you want to do what Kelvin, my mentor, always said. He called it anticipatory management, right? Think about what's going to happen and start to plan for that right now so that it doesn't become a crisis. So that's preventative in nature. Let's save the clarion call for last. Let's then go to the siren song. You have significant issues, but they're likely to diminish over time. How do you handle that as a leader?
That's a really good question, because sometimes it's not, and I'm kind of repeating myself here, but sometimes it's not clear, right, to you whether it's going to be a short-term issue or it's going to be a long-term.
Therefore, what should you do if it's not clear?
Well, if you can find clarity, if there is, if you can go find some additional information inputs to help clarify, I think that's helpful, because often, to simplify things, as you mentioned, this all comes down to people, right? So in our own families, sometimes the kid that's the loudest, that complains the most or whatever, may end up getting more attention because the kid is just talking all the time. Whereas, the quiet one that's sitting over in the corner is not making any fuss, ends up being ignored because we're spending all of our energy trying to take care of the one who's demanding all of our time. And as you mentioned with media, right? Media, whether it's traditional media or social media, can be amplifying a minority of voices very loudly,
So
so
if you are a CEO and you get involved in that situation, what does that message send to everybody, including your employees?
well, I guess it depends on the situation, right? But
But it says that this is an important situation, and it may not be.
oh, yes.
Right. So if you get involved as the CEO, instead of waiting and watching and just keeping an even keel, or maintaining, as the article says, equanimity, right? Let your team handle it. Very similar to the whisper warnings is if you get involved, you're actually sending the message that you're escalating this, and it's more important than it actually is. It's okay to just say, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. Let it go. And then just resist unnecessary involvement is really, because actually you could escalate the situation by your involvement.
Yeah, especially if you say the wrong things, right? So what are some great examples of this today? What have we seen with university presidents hauled in front of Congress to
I
talk about
actually
Israel
had that.
Hamas,
I had that on my notes. Thank you for reminding me. That's
right?
exactly what I was thinking. Yes.
Who, you know, and this is not to diminish the seriousness of what is going on in the Middle East, because it is incredibly serious what's going on there.
It is.
And, the anti-Semitism that is happening here is also a very serious thing as well. So I think it was appropriate for presidents of universities to address this situation. But what happened is you have people advising these presidents, basically saying, you're in a tricky situation. You got to walk a fine line. And they just ended up messing it up completely, right? They just they ended up turning what could have been a siren song into a clarion call, and really inflamed the situation, made it a lot worse because they just handled it so inappropriately. So it's hard in a position of a CEO or somebody in
They
a
turned it
position of
into a
authority,
clarion call, but they
where
meant to actually.
the
They meant
public
to.
is demanding, where public is demanding, you need to come up and say something because this is a tremendously serious issue. And so you're kind of in a difficult situation, because if you step back and you don't do anything, you don't say anything, then you're signaling to the masses that they don't matter. And at the same time, if you do tackle it head on and you say, okay, I'm going to address this situation, and you do it wrong because you are taking advice from attorneys instead of your PR folks, or vice versa, or you're not even listening to your gut, then you just make it 10 times worse. And that's what happened.
I wonder what would have happened. So, I mean, I talked to my son-in-law about this, who had 2 degrees from Harvard. So we had the presidents of Penn, MIT, and Harvard testify in front of Congress, right, about basically anti-Semitism and threats to both Muslims and Jews on their campuses, and people feeling unsafe. And I just asked my son-in-law about this. He says, this they made it about free speech. He says there has not been free speech on these campuses decades. Professors and presidents have been fired, even presidents who said something that was true, or just asked, hey, we should consider this issue on, for example, there was someone was fired for saying, are there biological differences between men and women about which careers they're drawn to? And just by asking that question, that individual was fired. Even You talk about freedom of speech is what President Gay said, that's why they allowed all these demonstrations that talk about intifada or threatening people's lives. And so that's the hypocrisy that people are building on. And so they didn't respond in an appropriate way, which is really unfortunate for the schools. They're losing billions of dollars of donations, and now they are in absolutely a clarion call situation.
Yeah. Well, gosh, Spencer, I'm up against it here. We've
Me
been
too.
going for an hour in this conversation. I love this conversation, but I got to wrap it up.
So
Because
did we give what they need to do in that crisis clarion call situation? You need to mobilize the troops, and you need to come up with multiple strategies, and don't retreat into isolation. Stay aware of different agendas of the team. Stay on top of that. But that's where you want to have your all hands on deck and utilize all the brain power that you have. So that's all I have to say about those 4 areas and how you best respond.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add to that is assuming that your values and principles are correct.
Yes.
Stick to your principles and don't deviate from your core values, because you can address a situation by still staying true to your values
Great
and
advice.
principles. And I'm not necessarily saying that from a moral perspective, although from a personal perspective, it is certainly that way. But I mean, all of our organizations have mission, vision, value statements,
And that's actually the question that Congress was asking those presidents. Is your behavior in alignment with your stated values? That's really interesting that you brought that up. And that was the challenge that's hurt them.
Yeah. So stick to your principles. So Spencer, this has been an illuminating, fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time. And you've helped so many organizations over decades. If people want to learn more about how you could help them to implement this reactive framework or to build these high-performing teams so that they can be one of the 12% of high-performing teams, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
So connect with me and let's increase that 12% to, at least 20%. And just reach out to me on LinkedIn, please. Spencer Horn and Christian. I always, every time I'm anywhere around the country, I talk about you and I introduce people to you, and they just absolutely love and admire you and the work that you do and how you help organizations. How can people find you?
Same, LinkedIn. Just look for Christian Napier on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with anyone. So it's been a fascinating hour of conversation for me, Spencer. Listeners, viewers, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. Please like and subscribe our podcast, and we'll catch you again soon.